I used to think that when someone you love calls you a hypochondriac, they're just concerned about your well-being in their own misguided way. What I never imagined was that my own daughter and son-in-law would spend 3 years systematically dismissing every symptom, every doctor's visit, every legitimate health concern I raised, all while secretly planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could seize control of my estate. What they didn't know was that I had been recording every conversation, documenting every dismissal, and building a case that would ultimately expose them for the manipulative vultures they really were. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first sign should have been when I mentioned the chest pains to my daughter Rebecca during our weekly Sunday dinner. I had been experiencing sharp, stabbing sensations in my left side for weeks, accompanied by shortness of breath that left me winded after climbing a single flight of stairs. At 62, I knew my body well enough to recognize when something wasn't right, but Rebecca barely looked up from her plate of roasted chicken when I brought it up. "Mom, you always think something's wrong with you," she said with that dismissive laugh I was beginning to know too well. Her husband Daniel nodded in agreement, cutting into his meat with unnecessary force. "Remember last year when you were convinced you had diabetes because you felt thirsty? Turned out you just needed to drink more water." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment, but I pressed on. "This is different, Rebecca. The pain is sharp and it radiates down my arm sometimes. I made an appointment with Dr. Morrison for Tuesday." Daniel set down his fork and fixed me with that patronizing stare he'd perfected over the 7 years he'd been married to my daughter. "Martha, with all due respect, you've been to more doctors in the past year than most people see in a decade. Maybe it's time to consider that the problem isn't physical." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Rebecca reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for confused elderly patients in nursing homes. "What Daniel means is that sometimes anxiety can manifest as physical symptoms. Maybe you should talk to someone about the stress you've been under since Dad passed." My late husband Frank had been gone for 2 years, and while I missed him terribly, I had worked through my grief with a counselor and felt emotionally stable. The suggestion that my chest pains were somehow psychosomatic felt like a slap across the face, but I swallowed my indignation and finished my meal in silence. Dr. Morrison took my concerns seriously, running an EKG and ordering blood work that revealed elevated cardiac enzymes. Within a week, I was scheduled for a cardiac catheterization that showed a 70% blockage in my left anterior descending artery. The cardiologist, Dr. Chen, explained that I would need a stent placement and prescribed medications to prevent a heart attack. When I called Rebecca with the news, expecting concern or at least acknowledgement that my symptoms had been real, her response chilled me to the bone. "Are you sure you understood the doctor correctly? That seems like a pretty serious diagnosis for someone who just had chest pains. Did you bring someone with you to the appointment?" The question struck me as odd. I had been managing my own medical care for decades, and Frank had always trusted my ability to communicate with healthcare providers. "Of course I understood, Rebecca. I'm not senile. I have copies of all the reports if you'd like to see them." No, that's not what I meant," she backpedaled quickly. "It's just that medical terminology can be confusing, and sometimes patients misinterpret what doctors are saying. Maybe Daniel and I should come with you to your next appointment." Something in her tone set off alarm bells in my mind, but I couldn't quite articulate what bothered me about her response. It felt less like concern and more like doubt, as if she was questioning my mental capacity rather than my physical health. The stent procedure went smoothly, and within a few weeks I was feeling dramatically better. The chest pains had disappeared, and I could climb stairs without gasping for breath. I had expected my family to be relieved, perhaps even apologetic, for their earlier dismissiveness, but their reaction surprised me. "Well, I'm glad everything worked out. Rebecca said when I called to share the good news. "Though I still think you might have been overreacting a bit. Lots of people have minor heart procedures these days." Minor heart procedure. I stared at the phone in disbelief. A 70% blockage that could have killed me was being dismissed as minor. Daniel's voice came through the background, and I could hear him asking Rebecca something about my insurance coverage and whether the procedure had been expensive. Over the following months, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Every health concern I raised was met with skepticism, eye-rolling, or suggestions that I was being dramatic. When I developed a persistent cough that lasted for 6 weeks, Rebecca suggested I was probably just seeking attention. When I noticed changes in my vision that prompted an emergency visit to an ophthalmologist, Daniel questioned whether I was exaggerating my symptoms to get sympathy. The ophthalmologist diagnosed me with early-stage glaucoma and prescribed eye drops to prevent vision loss. When I shared this news, Rebecca's first question wasn't about my prognosis or treatment plan, but whether I was sure I could manage the medication schedule on my own. "Eye drops every day can be tricky to remember, Mom. Maybe we should look into getting you one of those pill organizers. Or better yet, someone could come check on you daily to make sure you're taking them correctly." The suggestion of daily check-ins felt less like care and more like surveillance. I had been managing complex medication regimens for my late husband during his final illness, coordinating multiple specialists and keeping detailed records of his symptoms and treatments. The idea that I couldn't handle eye drops seemed absurd, but it was the mammogram results that truly opened my eyes to what was happening. During my annual screening, the radiologist found a suspicious area that required additional imaging and ultimately a biopsy. The 3 days between the biopsy and results were agonizing, filled with the kind of existential dread that only comes with facing one's mortality. When the pathology report came back benign, I felt a flood of relief so intense that I actually cried in the doctor's office. The radiologist, Dr. Santos, explained that while the mass was not cancerous, it would need to be monitored with more frequent screenings due to my family history of breast cancer. I called Rebecca immediately, my voice still shaky with emotion. The biopsy came back clear. It's not cancer. Her response was not relief or congratulations, but irritation. "Mom, you're being so dramatic about this. You've had lumps before that turned out to be nothing. Why are you putting yourself through all this stress for something that's probably just a cyst?" I felt as if the wind had been knocked out of me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Rebecca, this was a biopsy. There was a real concern that it could be malignant. The radiologist said I need more frequent screenings because they want to make money off you." Daniel's voice cut through the line. He had apparently taken the phone from Rebecca. "These doctors order unnecessary tests all the time, especially for older patients. They know insurance will pay for it, and patients like you who worry about every little thing are easy targets." The accusation that I was being scammed by medical professionals felt like a personal attack on my intelligence and judgment. Had been carefully selecting doctors based on recommendations and credentials, asking thoughtful questions about treatment options, and maintaining detailed records of my medical history. The suggestion that I was some kind of naive victim being exploited by the healthcare system was both insulting and bewildering. But what troubled me most was the underlying message: that my health concerns were not valid, that my symptoms were either imaginary or exaggerated, and that my judgment about my own body could not be trusted. It was a systematic undermining of my autonomy and credibility that felt deliberate and calculated. The breaking point came 6 months later when I developed what I initially thought was a stomach flu. The nausea and abdominal pain were severe enough that I could barely keep liquids down, and after 3 days with no improvement, I drove myself to the emergency room. The ER physician, Dr. Williams, ran blood tests and imaging that revealed acute cholecystitis, inflammation of the gallbladder with signs of infection. I would need emergency surgery to remove the gallbladder before it ruptured and caused life-threatening complications. "Mrs. Henderson, you were right to come in when you did," Dr. Williams explained as we waited for the surgical team. "If you had waited much longer, this could have been very serious. Gallbladder rupture can lead to sepsis, which can be fatal." I was admitted immediately for surgery, and the procedure went well. When I woke up in recovery, the surgeon, Dr. Patel, explained that my gallbladder had been severely inflamed and filled with stones. She showed me photos from the laparoscopic procedure, pointing out the areas of infection and explaining how the inflammation could have led to rupture if left untreated. "You have excellent instincts about your body," she told me with a smile. "Many patients ignore symptoms like yours and end up in much worse condition. You probably saved yourself from a very dangerous situation by seeking treatment when you did." I called Rebecca from my hospital bed, expecting that news of emergency surgery might finally convince her that my health concerns were legitimate. Instead, her reaction left me speechless. "Emergency surgery? Are you sure it was really an emergency? Sometimes doctors like to use scary language to justify procedures. Did you get a second opinion?" I stared at the ceiling tiles, trying to process what I was hearing. "Rebecca, my gallbladder was infected and could have ruptured. The surgeon showed me pictures of the inflammation. There wasn't time for a second opinion." "Well, you always tend to catastrophize things. I'm sure it wasn't as serious as they made it sound. These doctors love to create drama to justify their fees. When are you being discharged?" The word catastrophize hit me like a physical blow. I had just undergone emergency surgery to remove an organ that could have killed me if it ruptured, and my own daughter was suggesting that I was being overdramatic about the situation. Daniel's voice came through the background again, and I could hear him asking about my insurance coverage and whether the surgery would be expensive. There was something in their tone that made my skin crawl, a kind of calculating coldness that seemed focused more on financial implications than my well-being. Over the next few days in the hospital, I had time to think about the pattern of responses I had been receiving from Rebecca and Daniel. Every medical issue, from the minor to the life-threatening, had been met with the same dismissive attitude. They questioned my judgment, suggested I was being manipulated by doctors, and consistently minimized the severity of legitimate health problems. But it was more than just dismissiveness. There was something systematic about their approach, as if they were building a case that I was mentally unstable or incapable of making rational decisions about my health. The suggestions about medication management, the questions about whether I understood doctors correctly, the implications that I was being scammed. It all pointed to a deliberate effort to undermine my credibility. When Rebecca finally visited me in the hospital on my second day of recovery, she brought a stack of pamphlets about anxiety disorders and hypochondria. She set them on my bedside table with a concerned expression that felt more performative than genuine. "I've been doing some research, Mom, and I think you might benefit from talking to someone about health anxiety. It's a real condition that affects a lot of people, especially after losing a spouse. There are treatments available that could help you feel less worried about every little symptom." I looked at the pamphlets with their cheerful fonts and stock A photos of worried-looking people, and something crystallized in my mind. This wasn't concern for my mental health. This was a deliberate attempt to pathologize my legitimate medical advocacy for myself. "Rebecca, I've had a heart stent, glaucoma treatment, and emergency gallbladder surgery in the past year. These weren't anxiety-related problems. They were real medical conditions that required real medical treatment." She reached over and patted my hand with that same condescending gentleness I had come to dread. "Of course they were real, Mom, but the way you react to health issues, the level of worry and drama you create around every doctor's visit, that's what we're concerned about. You turn everything into a crisis." The word drama sent a chill down my spine. I realized that my daughter saw my legitimate health concerns as theatrical performances rather than genuine medical needs. In her mind, I was an actress seeking attention rather than a patient seeking appropriate care. That night, alone in my hospital room, I made a decision that would change everything. I purchased a small digital recorder and began documenting every conversation I had with Rebecca and Daniel about my health. If they were going to question my mental capacity and judgment, I was going to have evidence of exactly what was being said and how my medical needs were being dismissed. What I discovered over the following weeks was even more disturbing than I had imagined. Not only were they consistently minimizing my health concerns, but they were also having detailed discussions about my finances, my insurance coverage, and what they called my medical spending. During one recorded phone conversation, Daniel mentioned that my recent medical expenses were eating into the inheritance and suggested that I might need someone to help manage my healthcare decisions to prevent unnecessary procedures. The phrase unnecessary procedures made my blood run cold. A heart stent that prevented a heart attack was unnecessary? Emergency gallbladder surgery that prevented sepsis was unnecessary? Glaucoma treatment that preserved my vision was unnecessary? I began to understand that this wasn't just about dismissing my health concerns. This was about controlling my access to medical care and, ultimately, controlling my finances. By painting me as a hypochondriac who was being manipulated by greedy doctors, they were laying the groundwork to intervene in my medical decisions and potentially gain control over my assets. The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. Rebecca and Daniel weren't concerned about my health at all. They were concerned about their inheritance, and they saw my medical care as an obstacle to their financial future. I started paying closer attention to their conversations and behavior, and the evidence mounted quickly. During family dinners, Daniel would make casual comments about the cost of my medications or suggest that I was spending too much on unnecessary doctor visits. Rebecca would question whether I really needed to see specialists or whether my primary care physician could handle all my medical needs. They began offering to accompany me to medical appointments, not out of support, but to help me understand what the doctors were saying, and to make sure I wasn't being taken advantage of. When I politely declined their offers, they would exchange meaningful glances that I was beginning to recognize as communication about my supposed mental decline. The most chilling conversation I recorded happened during a Sunday dinner about 3 months after my gallbladder surgery. I had mentioned that Dr. Chen wanted to adjust my heart medication based on my latest blood work, and Daniel immediately questioned whether the adjustment was necessary. "Martha, you've been on those heart medications for months now. How do you know this doctor isn't just trying to keep you as a patient by constantly changing your prescriptions? Sometimes the simplest explanation is that you're being over-medicated." Rebecca nodded in agreement. "Mom, we're worried that you're not thinking critically about these medical recommendations. You just accept whatever any doctor tells you without question. That's not like you used to be." The implication was clear. I was no longer capable of making rational decisions about my medical care. They were suggesting that my judgment had deteriorated to the point where I was blindly following medical advice without proper consideration. But what happened next was what truly revealed their intentions. Daniel leaned forward with that concerned expression he had perfected and said, "Martha, Rebecca and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider having someone help you make these important healthcare decisions. Someone who can be objective and look out for your best interests." The phrase, "look out for your best interests," sent ice through my veins. I recognized it as legal language often used in guardianship proceedings. They weren't just questioning my medical judgment. They were laying the foundation to have me declared incompetent so they could make medical and financial decisions on my behalf. I managed to keep my voice steady as I responded. "That's very thoughtful of you both, but I feel quite capable of managing my own health care. My doctors seem pleased with how I'm following treatment recommendations and monitoring my symptoms." Rebecca and Daniel exchanged another one of those meaningful glances, and I knew I was running out of time. Whatever they were planning, It was moving forward whether I cooperated or not. That night, I sat in my home office surrounded by medical records, insurance statements, and legal documents, trying to understand exactly what I was facing. My health issues were real and well documented by multiple specialists. My medical care had been appropriate and necessary. My decision-making capacity was intact, as evidenced by my successful management of complex treatment regimens and my ability to advocate effectively for myself with healthcare providers. But I also understood that reality and perception could be very different things in legal proceedings. If Rebecca and Daniel could convince a court that I was a hypochondriac who was being manipulated by doctors into unnecessary treatments, they might be able to gain guardianship over my medical and financial decisions. The irony was devastating. By dismissing my legitimate health concerns as dramatic overreactions, they were positioning themselves to take control of the very assets I had spent a lifetime building: my home, my retirement savings, my investment portfolio, everything, Frankie. And I had worked for could be placed under their control if they successfully painted me as mentally incompetent. I realized that their 3-year campaign of medical gaslighting had been a deliberate strategy. Every time they questioned my judgment, suggested I was being scammed by doctors, or implied that I was mentally declining, they were building a case that could be used against me in court. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. While they were busy planning to take control of my life, I had been quietly documenting everything. Every dismissive comment, every suggestion that I was mentally declining, every conversation about my medical expenses and their impact on the inheritance, I had it all on record. More importantly, I had an extensive paper trail of legitimate medical care from respected physicians who could testify to my mental capacity and the appropriateness of my treatment. Dr. Chen could confirm that my heart condition was real and potentially life-threatening without treatment. Dr. Santos could verify that my mammogram concerns were valid and that my monitoring schedule was medically necessary. Dr. Patel could attest that my gallbladder surgery was emergency, treatment that prevented life-threatening complications. As I sat in my office that night, surrounded by evidence of both my legitimate medical needs and my family's systematic attempt to undermine me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: power. They thought they were playing a game where they held all the cards, but they didn't realize that I had been collecting evidence of their manipulation from the very beginning. The next morning, I made several phone calls that would set in motion a plan I had been developing for weeks. First, I contacted my attorney, Margaret Walsh, and scheduled an appointment to discuss estate planning and potential guardianship concerns. Then I called my primary care physician and asked for copies of all my medical records from the past 3 years. Finally, I contacted a private investigator who specialized in elder abuse cases. What Rebecca and Daniel didn't know was that I had been preparing for this battle long before they realized we were at war. While they thought they were manipulating a confused, medically anxious older woman, I had been building a case that would expose them for what they really were: financial predators who saw my health concerns as obstacles to their inheritance. The game was about to change dramatically, and this time, I would be the one controlling the narrative. They had called me dramatic about my health, but they were about to discover just how dramatic I could be when my entire life's work was at stake. I had spent 62 years learning to trust my instincts, advocate for myself, and fight for what was right. Rebecca and Daniel were about to learn that dismissing someone as a hypochondriac doesn't make them weak. It makes them angry. And an angry woman with legitimate grievances, solid evidence, and nothing left to lose is a force that should never be underestimated. The irony was perfect. They had spent 3 years telling me I was too dramatic about my health. Soon, they would discover that I had been perfectly dramatic when I decided to disinherit them completely. The meeting with Margaret Walsh 3 days later confirmed my worst fears and gave me the tools I needed to fight back. Margaret had been Frank's attorney for over 20 years, and she knew our family dynamics well enough to understand the gravity of what I was describing. "Martha, what you're telling me sounds like a textbook case of financial elder abuse," she said, reviewing the notes I had prepared. "The systematic undermining of your medical judgment, the questions about your mental capacity, the focus on inheritance costs. These are classic warning signs that someone is positioning for a guardianship petition." She explained that guardianship proceedings often began with family members expressing concern about an elderly person's decision-making capacity, particularly around medical and financial matters. If Rebecca and Daniel could convince a judge that I was making irrational healthcare decisions based on anxiety or hypochondria, they could potentially gain control over my medical care and eventually my finances. "The good news is that you've been documenting everything," Margaret continued, examining the recordings and medical records I had brought. "These conversations show a clear pattern of dismissing legitimate medical concerns. Combined with your extensive medical documentation proving that your health issues are real and appropriately treated, we have a strong foundation for defense." But Margaret's next suggestion surprised me. "However, I think we should consider taking a more proactive approach. Rather than waiting for them to petition for guardianship, we should explore options that put you back in control of the situation." She outlined several strategies we could pursue. First, we could create ironclad advance directives and healthcare proxies that explicitly excluded Rebecca and Daniel from medical decision-making. Second, we could restructure my estate in ways that would make it impossible for them to benefit from any attempt to control my assets. Third, we could document their behavior so thoroughly that any future guardianship petition would be immediately dismissed. "But Martha," Margaret said, leaning forward with a serious expression, "if you really want to send a message about how you feel about their treatment of you, we could explore something more dramatic. Complete disinheritance with a detailed explanation of why you're making that choice." The word dramatic made me smile grimly. After 3 years of being told I was too dramatic about my health, the idea of being dramatic about my estate planning felt like poetic justice. I left Margaret's office with a clear plan and several homework assignments. She wanted me to continue documenting conversations with Rebecca and Daniel, but now with specific focus on any discussions about my mental capacity or their concerns about my medical spending. She also wanted me to schedule comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluations that would establish my mental competency beyond any doubt. The psychological evaluation was scheduled with Dr. Amanda Foster, a neuropsychologist who specialized in capacity assessments. Over the course of 2 lengthy sessions, she administered tests measuring memory, judgment, reasoning ability, and decision-making capacity. She also interviewed me extensively about my medical history, family relationships, and current life circumstances. "Mrs. Henderson, I want to be very clear about my findings," Dr. Foster said during our final session. "Your cognitive function is well within normal limits for your age group. In fact, your performance on several measures was above average. You demonstrate excellent insight into your medical conditions, appropriate judgment about treatment decisions, and clear understanding of complex family dynamics." She paused, reviewing her notes. "Based on your description of your family's behavior and my assessment of your cognitive abilities, I would be very concerned about any attempt to question your decision-making capacity. You are clearly competent to make your own medical and financial decisions." Dr. Foster's report became a crucial piece of documentation that would protect me from any future competency challenges. But more importantly, her validation of my cognitive abilities reinforced my confidence in the plan I was developing. The next phase involved restructuring my estate in ways that would surprise Rebecca and Daniel. Margaret helped me create a new will that removed them as beneficiaries entirely, replacing them with charitable organizations that focused on elder abuse prevention and medical research. We also established a living trust that would make it impossible for anyone to contest my final wishes or claim that I had been unduly influenced. But the most satisfying part of the plan was the detailed letter of explanation that would accompany my new will. Margaret suggested that I document not just what I was doing, but why I was doing it, with specific examples of the behavior that had led to my decision. Writing that letter became a cathartic exercise in reclaiming my narrative. For 3 years, Rebecca and Daniel had been telling a story about me, that I was a hypochondriac, a drama queen, a confused older woman who couldn't make rational decisions about her health. Now I would tell my own story, with documentation to support every claim. I wrote about the chest pains that Rebecca dismissed as anxiety, only to discover I had a 70% arterial blockage that could have killed me. I detailed the vision. Changes that Daniel suggested were imaginary, which turned out to be glaucoma requiring immediate treatment to prevent blindness. I described the abdominal pain they said was psychosomatic, which was actually an infected gallbladder that could have ruptured and caused fatal sepsis. But I also wrote about the deeper betrayal, the systematic way they had undermined my confidence in my own judgment, the calculated dismissal of my legitimate health concerns, and the financial motivations that had driven their behavior. The letter became a comprehensive indictment of their treatment of me, supported by recorded conversations and medical documentation. As I worked on the letter over several weeks, I began to feel a sense of empowerment I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since this ordeal began, I was controlling the narrative instead of being subjected to it. Meanwhile, Rebecca and Daniel seemed to be escalating their campaign. During a family dinner in early November, Daniel brought up the subject of my medical expenses with unprecedented directness. Martha, Rebecca, and I have been looking at your insurance statements, and we're concerned about the pattern of specialist visits and procedures you've been having. In the past year alone, you've seen a cardiologist, an ophthalmologist, a surgeon, and several other specialists. That's not normal for someone your age. I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my voice calm. Daniel, I've had several health issues that required specialist care. That's exactly what insurance is for. Rebecca jumped in with what I now recognized as a rehearsed response. But Mom, the pattern is concerning. You're constantly worried about something being wrong with you. Every minor symptom sends you running to a doctor. It's not healthy, and it's expensive. The recorder in my purse was capturing every word, but I wanted to push them to be even more explicit about their concerns. I don't understand what you're suggesting. Are you saying I shouldn't seek medical care when I have symptoms? Daniel and Rebecca exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Daniel responded. We're saying that maybe you need someone to help you evaluate whether medical care is really necessary. Someone who can be objective about your symptoms and help you distinguish between real health concerns and anxiety-related worries. There it was, the direct suggestion that I needed supervision for my medical decisions. I pressed a little further. Are you suggesting that my doctors are wrong about my diagnoses? That my heart condition, glaucoma, and gallbladder problems weren't real? Of course they were real, Rebecca said quickly. But the way you reacted to them, the level of panic and drama you created around each situation, that's what we're concerned about. You turn every medical issue into a crisis. The word crisis joined drama and panic in their vocabulary of dismissal. I was beginning to see how carefully they had crafted their language to suggest mental instability without making direct accusations. But then Daniel said something that revealed the true scope of their planning. Martha, we've actually been talking to someone about options for helping family members who might need assistance with major life decisions. There are legal mechanisms available that can ensure someone gets the support they need while protecting their assets from unnecessary depletion. Legal mechanisms, asset protection. The euphemisms were thinly veiled references to guardianship proceedings, and the fact that they had been talking to someone about it meant they were already consulting with an attorney. I felt a chill of fear, but also a surge of determination. They were moving faster than I had anticipated, which meant I needed to accelerate my own timeline. That night, I called Margaret Walsh at home and explained what had happened during dinner. She agreed that we needed to move quickly to establish additional protections before Rebecca and Daniel could file any legal petitions. "Martha, I want you to schedule appointments with all of your doctors for comprehensive evaluations," she said. "We need current documentation of your health status and cognitive abilities from every physician who's treating you. If they're planning a competency challenge, we need to be prepared with overwhelming evidence that you're making appropriate medical decisions." Over the next 2 weeks, I visited Dr. Chen for a cardiac evaluation, Dr. Santos for an ophthalmologic assessment, Dr. Foster for an updated cognitive evaluation, and my primary care physician for a comprehensive physical exam. Each physician provided detailed reports confirming that my medical care was appropriate, my decision-making was sound, and my cognitive abilities were intact. But the most important appointment was with Dr. Lisa Park, a geriatric psychiatrist, who specialized in capacity evaluations for legal proceedings. Margaret had recommended her as someone who could provide an independent assessment that would carry significant weight in any court proceeding. Dr. Park spent 3 hours with me, conducting extensive interviews and psychological testing. She reviewed my medical history, my family dynamics, and the recordings I had made of conversations with Rebecca and Daniel. "Mrs. Henderson, what you've described is a classic example of medical gaslighting," she said after completing her evaluation. "Your family members have been systematically undermining your confidence in your own judgment about legitimate health concerns. This is a form of psychological abuse that can be extremely damaging to older adults." She explained that medical gaslighting often occurred when family members had financial motivations for discouraging medical care. By portraying an elderly person as a hypochondriac or as mentally declining, they could justify taking control of medical and financial decisions. "Your medical history shows appropriate health care utilization for legitimate conditions, Dr. Park continued. "Your cognitive testing shows intact decision-making abilities. Your psychological profile shows no evidence of anxiety disorders or hypochondria. What it does show is someone who has been subjected to systematic psychological manipulation designed to undermine your autonomy." Dr. Park's report became the cornerstone of my legal defense. But more importantly, her validation of my experiences helped me understand that I wasn't imagining the manipulation. It was real, it was deliberate, and it was abusive. Armed with comprehensive medical and psychological documentation, Margaret and I finalized the new estate plan. The will was ironclad, the trust was uncontestable, and the letter of explanation was devastatingly thorough. But we also prepared for the possibility that Rebecca and Daniel might try to challenge my capacity before the new will could take effect. Margaret filed documents with the court establishing my current mental competency, along with all the medical and psychological evaluations I had undergone. "If they try to petition for guardianship now," Margaret explained, "they'll be walking into a courtroom where we've already established your capacity with overwhelming documentation. Any petition they file will be immediately dismissed, and their motivations will be exposed." The trap was set, but I wanted to give them one final opportunity to reveal their true intentions. I decided to host a Thanksgiving dinner and see how far they would push their campaign to undermine my autonomy. The dinner was set for the 3rd Thursday in November, and I invited Rebecca, Daniel, and Daniel's brother Michael, who had always seemed more reasonable than the other two. I wanted a witness to whatever conversation might unfold. As I prepared for what I knew would be a crucial evening, I reflected on how much had changed since that first dismissed complaint about chest pains. 3 years ago, I had been a grieving widow trying to rebuild her life after losing her husband. I had trusted my daughter and son-in-law to support me through difficult times, and I had been naive enough to believe that family love would override financial greed. Now I understood that I had been targeted for financial exploitation from the moment Frank died. My medical needs had been seen as obstacles to their inheritance, and my legitimate health concerns had been weaponized against me to justify taking control of my life. But they had made a critical error in their calculations. They had assumed that undermining my confidence would make me weak and dependent. Instead, it had made me angry and determined. They had expected me to capitulate to their narrative of mental decline. Instead, I had built an impenetrable case proving my competency. Most importantly, they had thought they were playing a game where they held all the advantages: youth, energy, legal knowledge, and family positioning. What they didn't realize was that I had been playing a different game entirely, one where documentation, evidence, and legal preparation were the winning strategies. The Thanksgiving dinner would be their final opportunity to show their true colors. After that, they would discover that the woman they had dismissed as a dramatic hypochondriac was actually a strategic opponent who had been several steps ahead of them from the beginning. As I set the table that evening, placing my small recorder in its usual spot in my purse, I felt a sense of calm anticipation. Whatever happened during dinner, I was prepared for it. The question was whether Rebecca and Daniel were prepared for what would happen afterward. The doorbell rang at precisely 5 o'clock, and I opened it to find Rebecca carrying a casserole dish and Daniel holding a bottle of wine. Michael arrived a few minutes later with flowers and an apologetic smile for being late. "Mom, you've outdone yourself," Rebecca said, surveying the table with its traditional Thanksgiving spread. "This must have taken you all day to prepare." I smiled and accepted the compliment, though I noticed Daniel's quick glance around the room as if he was assessing the value of the furniture and artwork. It was a look I had learned to recognize over the past few months, the appraising gaze of someone mentally cataloging assets. The conversation during dinner was pleasant enough, covering safe topics like the weather, local news, and Michael's new job. But I could sense the tension building as Rebecca and Daniel waited for an opportunity to broach whatever they had planned to discuss. The moment came during dessert, when Michael excused himself to take a phone call from his wife. As soon as he left the room, Rebecca's demeanor shifted from casual family warmth to serious concern. "Mom, Daniel and I have been talking, and we think it's time to have an honest conversation about your health and your future." I set down my fork and looked at them expectantly. What kind of conversation? Daniel cleared his throat and assumed his most authoritative tone. "Martha, we're worried about you. Over the past few years, you've been experiencing what seems like constant health crises. You're always at the doctor, always worried about some new symptom, always convinced that something terrible is wrong with you." Rebecca nodded earnestly. "It's not healthy, Mom. The level of anxiety you have about your body, the way you catastrophize every minor ache or pain, it's affecting your quality of life." I felt the familiar surge of anger at their dismissive language, but I kept my voice steady. "Are you suggesting that my heart condition, glaucoma, and gallbladder problems were minor aches and pains?" "Of course not," Daniel said quickly. "But your reaction to them was disproportionate. The panic, the emergency room visits, the multiple specialist consultations. It was excessive." Rebecca leaned forward with that patronizing expression I had grown to despise. "Mom, we think you might be suffering from health anxiety. It's a real condition that affects many people, especially after losing a spouse, but it's treatable." The setup was perfect. They were painting me as mentally ill while positioning themselves as concerned family members seeking help for my condition. "What kind of treatment are you suggesting?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far they would push their narrative. Daniel and Rebecca exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Daniel responded. "We think you need professional help managing your healthcare decisions. Someone objective who can help you distinguish between real health concerns and anxiety-driven worries. And we think you need assistance managing your finances," Rebecca added. "All these medical expenses are adding up, and we're concerned that you might be vulnerable to healthcare providers who take advantage of anxious patients." There it was, the complete picture of their plan. They wanted control over my medical decisions and my financial assets, justified by their narrative of mental decline and health anxiety. But then Daniel said something that revealed just how far their planning had progressed. "Martha, we've already consulted with an attorney about options for helping family members who need this kind of support. There are legal mechanisms that can ensure you get appropriate care while protecting your assets from unnecessary depletion." The phrase "legal mechanisms" confirmed that they had moved beyond planning into active preparation for guardianship proceedings. They weren't just suggesting that I needed help, they were laying the groundwork to petition a court to force that help upon me. I decided to push them to be even more explicit. "Are you talking about some kind of legal guardianship?" Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, as if she was surprised by my directness. "Well, that's one option. But it would only be necessary if you continued to resist getting the help you need voluntarily." The threat was clear: submit to their control willingly, or they would seek legal authority to impose it. Daniel leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had presented an irrefutable argument. "Martha, we're trying to help you here. We can see that your judgment about medical matters has become compromised, and we want to prevent you from making decisions you might regret later." The condescension in his voice was infuriating, but I maintained my composure. "And what happens to my assets while you're helping me make these decisions?" "Your assets would be protected," Rebecca said quickly. "That's the whole point. Instead of depleting your savings on unnecessary medical procedures, your money would be preserved for your actual needs." The euphemism was transparent. My money would be preserved for their inheritance. Michael returned from his phone call, just as the conversation was reaching its climax, and I could see him picking up on the tension in the room. He glanced between his brother and Rebecca with a confused expression. "Did I miss something important?" he asked, settling back into his chair. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly at the interruption. "We were just discussing some concerns we have about Mom's health management." Michael looked at me with genuine concern. "Are you feeling okay, Martha? You seem to be in good health to me." I seized the opportunity to get an objective perspective. "Michael, do you think I've been making poor decisions about my medical care?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Poor decisions? You mean like the heart procedure that prevented a heart attack? Or the glaucoma treatment that's preserving your vision? Those seem like exactly the right decisions to me." Rebecca's face flushed slightly. "Michael, you don't understand the full picture. It's not about the individual medical issues. It's about Mom's overall pattern of health anxiety and medical overutilization." "Medical overutilization?" Michael repeated, his voice rising slightly. "She's had 3 serious health conditions that required treatment. How is that overutilization?" Daniel stepped in quickly, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Michael, you haven't been around for all the doctor visits, all the emergency room trips, all the panic about minor symptoms. Martha has been experiencing significant health anxiety that's affecting her judgment." But Michael wasn't buying it. "Wait a minute. Are you guys saying that Martha is mentally incompetent? Because that's not what I'm seeing at all." The word incompetent hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca and Daniel looked uncomfortable, realizing that their narrative wasn't as convincing to an objective observer as they had assumed. "We're not saying she's incompetent," Rebecca said defensively. "We're saying she needs support with major healthcare decisions." "Support she doesn't want," Michael pointed out. "And frankly, from what I can see, support she doesn't need. Martha seems perfectly capable of managing her own affairs." The conversation was spiraling away from Rebecca and Daniel's control, and I could see them growing more agitated by the minute. Daniel finally lost his composure entirely. "Look, the bottom line is that Martha is spending through her savings on unnecessary medical care, And if it continues, there won't be anything left for anyone to inherit. Someone needs to step in and protect those assets. The mask had finally slipped completely. Daniel had just admitted that their concern wasn't my well-being, it was their inheritance. Michael stared at his brother in shock. Are you seriously trying to control Martha's medical care because you're worried about your inheritance? That's disgusting, Daniel. Rebecca jumped to her husband's defense. It's not about the inheritance. It's about protecting Mom from being taken advantage of by doctors who order unnecessary tests and procedures. According to who? Michael demanded. Have you consulted with any of her doctors? Have you gotten second opinions? Or are you just deciding on your own that her medical care is inappropriate? The questions hung in the air unanswered because, of course, they had never consulted with my physicians. They had simply decided that my medical care was excessive based on their own financial motivations. I decided it was time to end this charade. Rebecca, Daniel, I think I understand your position clearly now. You believe I'm mentally incompetent to make my own medical decisions, and you want legal authority to make those decisions for me. Is that correct? They both looked uncomfortable with the direct phrasing, but Daniel nodded slowly. If that's what it takes to protect you from making poor decisions, then yes. And you believe my medical care has been inappropriate and excessive? Yes, Rebecca said firmly. And you think my spending on medical care is threatening your inheritance? Daniel's face reddened. That's not how I would put it. But it's accurate, isn't it? I pressed. Michael looked back and forth between us with growing understanding. Oh my God, you guys are trying to get Martha declared incompetent so you can control her money. This is elder abuse. The accusation of elder abuse seemed to galvanize Rebecca and Daniel. They realized that their plan had been exposed in front of a witness who wasn't sympathetic to their cause. Michael, you don't understand the situation, Rebecca said desperately. Mom needs help, and we're the only family she has left. She seems fine to me, Michael replied. And even if she did need help, that wouldn't justify taking control of her finances. Daniel stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Fine. We tried to do this the easy way, but if Martha wants to be stubborn about accepting help, we'll pursue other options. The threat was explicit now. They would move forward with legal proceedings whether I cooperated or not. What other options? Michael asked. Rebecca gathered her purse with shaking hands. Legal options. We've already consulted with an attorney about protecting Mom's interests when she's not capable of protecting them herself. As they prepared to leave, I made one final attempt to get them to reconsider their position. Rebecca, are you absolutely certain this is the path you want to take? Once you file legal papers questioning my competency, there's no going back from that. She paused at the door, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But Daniel's hand on her shoulder seemed to reinforce her resolve. Mom, we're doing this because we love you and want to protect you. I'm sorry you can't see that. After they left, Michael and I sat in my living room processing what had just happened. He was clearly shaken by his brother's behavior. Martha, I had no idea they were planning something like this. Daniel has always been focused on money, but I never thought he would try to have you declared incompetent just to control your inheritance. I appreciated his support, but I also knew that the battle lines had been drawn. Rebecca and Daniel would move forward with their legal challenge, and I needed to be prepared. Michael, I want you to know that I've been documenting everything. I have recordings of conversations, medical evaluations proving my competency, and legal protections already in place. His relief was visible. Thank God. I was worried they might actually succeed with this scheme. They might have, I admitted, if I hadn't started preparing months ago. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated me. As I cleaned up the dinner dishes that evening, I reflected on how perfectly the evening had unfolded. Rebecca and Daniel had revealed their true motivations in front of an independent witness. They had admitted that their concern was financial rather than medical. They had threatened legal action while demonstrating that they had no legitimate basis for questioning my competency. Most importantly, they had no idea what was waiting for them when they tried to implement their plan. While they had been spending months building a case based on speculation and financial motivation, I had been building a defense based on documented evidence and professional evaluations. The recorder in my purse had captured every damning word of their Thanksgiving confession. Combined with months of previous recordings, medical documentation, and psychological evaluations, I had assembled a case that would not only defeat their guardianship petition, but expose them as financial predators, targeting an elderly family member. But the real surprise was still to come. They thought they were fighting for control of my assets, but they didn't know that those assets were no longer available for them to control. While they had been planning their legal strategy, I had been implementing an estate plan that would remove them from any financial benefit entirely. The irony was perfect. They had spent 3 years telling me I was too dramatic about my health. Tomorrow, they would begin to discover just how dramatic I could be when my entire life's work was at stake. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The game they thought they were playing was over. The game I had been playing was just beginning. The phone rang at 7:30 the following Monday morning, jarring me from my coffee and morning news routine. Margaret Walsh's voice carried an urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Martha, they've filed the petition." Rebecca and Daniel submitted paperwork Friday afternoon requesting emergency guardianship based on claims of diminished mental capacity and vulnerability to financial exploitation by healthcare providers. I felt my heart rate spike, but not from anxiety this time. This was the adrenaline rush of a chess player who had been waiting for their opponent to make the anticipated move. How quickly can we respond? "I've already filed our counter-documentation. Your medical records, psychological evaluations, and cognitive assessments are being submitted today." "But Martha, there's something else. They're requesting an emergency hearing within 2 weeks, claiming you're in immediate danger of financial harm due to impaired judgment." The audacity was breathtaking. After 3 years of systematically undermining my medical decisions, they were now painting themselves as heroes rushing to save me from my own supposed incompetence. "What's our timeline?" I asked, reaching for the notebook where I had been tracking every detail of this situation. "The hearing is scheduled for December 15th. That gives us less than 3 weeks to prepare, but honestly, we're already better prepared than most people would be after months of planning. Your documentation is extraordinarily thorough." Margaret paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Martha, there's one more thing. The petition includes a request for immediate conservatorship of your assets pending the outcome of the hearing. They're asking the court to freeze your accounts and prevent you from making any major financial decisions." This was the nuclear option, an attempt to seize control of my finances immediately rather than waiting for the guardianship hearing. If successful, it would prevent me from accessing my own money while the legal proceedings unfolded. "Can they do that?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "They can request it, and unfortunately, some judges grant temporary conservatorships based on minimal evidence if they believe there's immediate financial risk. But in this case, I think we can demonstrate that the real risk is to you, not from you." Margaret explained that we would need to file an emergency counterpetition demonstrating not only my competency, but also the questionable motivations behind Rebecca and Daniel's actions. The recordings I had made would be crucial evidence, but we needed to be strategic about how we presented them. "I want to schedule a meeting with you and Dr. Foster this afternoon," Margaret continued. "We need her to review the petition and provide a professional response to their claims about your mental state." As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because everything I had predicted was coming to pass exactly as I had anticipated. Sadness because my own daughter was willing to have me declared mentally incompetent for financial gain. The meeting with Margaret and Dr. Foster that afternoon was both illuminating and infuriating. Dr. Foster reviewed the petition with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen similar cases before, but her disgust at the tactics being employed was evident. This is a textbook example of financial elder abuse disguised as concern for well-being, she said, scanning the legal documents. The language they're using: diminished capacity, vulnerability to exploitation, irrational healthcare spending. These are standard phrases used to justify taking control of an elderly person's autonomy. She pointed to specific sections of the petition that particularly concerned her. Look at this claim that you've spent excessive amounts on unnecessary medical procedures. They provide no evidence that any of your medical care was inappropriate, just assertions that the cost was high. Margaret nodded grimly. It's a classic strategy. Frame reasonable medical expenses as evidence of poor judgment, then position yourself as the rational party who needs to step in and protect the assets. But Dr. Foster's analysis of the psychological claims in the petition was even more damning. They're alleging that you suffer from health anxiety, resulting in compulsive medical-seeking behavior. This is complete nonsense based on my evaluation. Your medical utilization is entirely appropriate for someone with your documented health conditions. She flipped through her own evaluation notes. What's particularly egregious is that they're characterizing your appropriate advocacy for your own health as evidence of mental illness. This is psychological abuse designed to make you doubt your own judgment. The meeting reinforced my confidence in the defense we had prepared, but it also crystallized something else. My desire to ensure that Rebecca and Daniel faced consequences for their behavior that went beyond simply losing their guardianship petition. That evening, I made a phone call that would set the final phase of my plan into motion. I contacted Detective Sarah Reynolds with the County Elder Abuse Unit, a specialized division that investigated financial crimes against elderly victims. Mrs. Henderson, based on what you're describing, this sounds like it could constitute financial elder abuse under state law, Detective Reynolds said after I explained the situation. The systematic undermining of your medical judgment, the attempt to gain control of your assets, the threats of legal action, these could be prosecutable offenses. She explained that elder abuse cases often involved family members who used psychological manipulation to justify taking control of an elderly person's finances. The key was demonstrating that the alleged concern for well-being was actually motivated by financial gain. The recordings you've made could be crucial evidence, she continued, especially the conversations where they discuss the impact of your medical expenses on their inheritance. That shows clear financial motivation behind their actions. Detective Reynolds scheduled an appointment to review all my documentation and recordings. If she determined that crimes had been committed, the district attorney's office could potentially file charges independent of the civil guardianship proceedings. Meanwhile, I had one more card to play that Rebecca and Daniel knew nothing about. The new will and trust documents were already finalized and properly executed, but I hadn't yet informed them of the changes. I decided that the guardianship hearing would be the perfect venue for that revelation. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of legal preparation. Margaret assembled a comprehensive response to the guardianship petition that included medical records from 5 different physicians, psychological evaluations from 2 independent experts, cognitive testing results, and financial records demonstrating my careful management of assets. But the centerpiece of our defense was the audio evidence I had collected. Margaret worked with a forensic audio specialist to enhance the recordings and create transcripts that clearly captured every dismissive comment, every suggestion of mental decline, and every discussion of financial motivations. The most damaging recording was from the Thanksgiving dinner, where Daniel had explicitly admitted that his concern was protecting the inheritance rather than my well-being. When played in court, it would demolish any pretense that their actions were motivated by genuine concern for my welfare. 3 days before the hearing, I received an unexpected phone call from Rebecca. Her voice carried a tone I hadn't heard in months, uncertainty mixed with what might have been genuine emotion. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I wonder if we could talk before the hearing. Maybe we could work something out without having to go through with all this legal stuff." The offer was tempting, but I suspected it was motivated more by legal strategy than genuine remorse. Margaret had warned me that it was common for petitioners to attempt last-minute negotiations when they realized their case was weaker than expected. "What kind of arrangement are you thinking about?" I asked, genuinely curious about what she might propose. "Well, maybe we could set up some kind of informal arrangement where you could consult with us before making major medical or financial decisions. Nothing legal, just family looking out for each other." The proposal was essentially what they had wanted all along: control over my decisions without the legal hassle of a formal guardianship. It would give them veto power over my medical care and financial choices, while allowing them to maintain the fiction that they were helping rather than controlling. "Rebecca, why would I agree to give you decision-making authority over my life when you've spent 3 years telling me that my judgment is impaired?" There was a long pause before she responded. "Mom, we're family. I know we've had our disagreements about your health issues, but at the end of the day, we want what's best for you." The word disagreements was a masterful understatement. 3 years of systematic psychological abuse and manipulation were being reframed as mere disagreements. "And what you think is best for me is giving up my autonomy and letting you control my medical and financial decisions." Another pause. "It's not about control, Mom. It's about support. You don't have to make these difficult decisions alone anymore." The manipulation was so smooth and practiced that I almost admired the technique. She was reframing their desire for control as an offer of support, making it sound like I was being stubborn by insisting on my independence. "Rebecca, I appreciate the offer, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. If you were genuinely concerned about my well-being rather than your inheritance, you would respect that capability." The mention of inheritance seemed to break through her composed facade. "This isn't about money, Mom. It's about protecting you from making decisions you might regret later. Like the decision to get a heart stent that prevented a heart attack, or the decision to treat glaucoma that preserved my vision. Which of those decisions do you think I should regret?" She had no answer for that, because there was no answer. My medical decisions had been appropriate and necessary, and she knew it. "Mom, please, can't we just sit down and talk about this like a family?" I felt a moment of sadness for the relationship we had lost, but I also knew that bridge had been burned beyond repair. "Rebecca, we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk at the hearing on Thursday. I think that's the appropriate venue for this discussion now." After I hung up, I realized that the call had actually strengthened my resolve. Rebecca's attempt at manipulation, even in the face of legal proceedings, demonstrated that she still saw me as someone who could be controlled and maneuvered, rather than as an autonomous adult deserving of respect. The night before the hearing, I had trouble sleeping despite my confidence in our preparation. This wasn't just about winning a legal case anymore. It was about reclaiming my identity and autonomy after 3 years of systematic psychological abuse. I thought about Frank and how he had always supported my independence and decision-making abilities. He would have been appalled by Rebecca and Daniel's behavior, and he would have been proud of how I had fought back against their manipulation. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock Thursday morning in Judge Patricia Coleman's courtroom. Margaret had warned me that Judge Coleman was known for being thorough and fair, but also skeptical of guardianship petitions that seemed motivated by financial considerations. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, wearing my best Navy suit and carrying a briefcase containing copies of all the documentation we would be presenting. Margaret met me in the hallway outside the courtroom, and we reviewed our strategy one final time. "Remember, Martha, this hearing is about demonstrating your competency and exposing their motivations. Let me handle the legal arguments, but be prepared to answer questions about your medical care and decision-making process. When Rebecca and Daniel arrived with their attorney, I was struck by how different they looked. Gone were the confident expressions and patronizing smiles I had grown accustomed to. They both appeared nervous and uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with me as they took their seats on the opposite side of the courtroom. Their attorney, James Morrison, was a thin man in an expensive suit who specialized in elder law. Margaret had warned me that he was skilled at presenting guardianship cases in the most sympathetic light possible, but that he also had a reputation for taking cases with questionable motivations if the fees were sufficient. Judge Coleman called the hearing to order and asked Morrison to present his case first. What followed was a masterful performance of manipulation and misdirection that might have been convincing if I hadn't lived through the reality behind it. Morrison painted a picture of a concerned daughter and son-in-law who had watched helplessly as a beloved family member fell victim to health anxiety and predatory healthcare providers. He described my medical utilization as excessive and my financial spending as reckless, suggesting that I was vulnerable to exploitation due to diminished cognitive abilities. Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson has spent over $80,000 on medical care in the past 2 years alone, Morrison said, waving financial documents for dramatic effect. She has seen dozens of specialists, undergone numerous procedures, and continues to seek medical care for minor symptoms that could be managed with basic primary care. The implication was that I was either too mentally impaired to recognize that I was being scammed, or too psychologically disturbed to make rational decisions about my health. Morrison then called Rebecca to testify, and I watched my daughter take the witness stand and swear to tell the truth before proceeding to lie systematically about our relationship and my mental state. My mother has always been a strong, independent woman, Rebecca began, looking directly at the judge with practiced sincerity. But since my father's death, she's become increasingly anxious about her health. Every minor symptom becomes a crisis that requires emergency medical attention. She described incidents that I recognized as grossly distorted versions of legitimate health concerns. My chest pains became minor discomfort that she convinced herself was a heart attack. My vision changes became slight blurriness that she insisted required emergency treatment. My gallbladder attack became stomach upset that she escalated into emergency surgery. We've tried to be supportive, Rebecca continued, but she interprets any suggestion that she might be overreacting as an attack on her judgment. She's become suspicious and defensive, which only confirms our concern that her thinking has become impaired. The performance was flawless in its manipulation. She had taken my appropriate medical advocacy and reframed it as mental illness, then used my resistance to their control as evidence that their control was necessary. Daniel's testimony followed the same script, focusing on financial concerns and my alleged vulnerability to healthcare exploitation. He presented himself as a reluctant family member forced to take action to protect someone he loved from her own poor judgment. Mrs. Henderson is being taken advantage of by doctors who order unnecessary tests and procedures, Daniel testified. She's unable to recognize that she's being exploited because her anxiety about her health overrides her, normally, good judgment. When Morrison finished presenting his case, I felt a wave of disgust at how effectively they had distorted reality. If I hadn't lived through the actual events they were describing, I might have been convinced by their narrative of concern and protection. But then Margaret stood up to present our defense, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of diminished capacity requiring guardianship. What we have is a case of financial elder abuse disguised as family concern. Mrs. Henderson is a competent adult who has been subjected to 3 years of systematic psychological manipulation designed to undermine her confidence in her own judgment. Margaret began with the medical documentation, calling Dr. Chen to testify about my heart condition and the necessity of my cardiac care. Dr. Chen's testimony was devastating to Rebecca and Daniel's case. Mrs. Henderson presented with classic symptoms of cardiac disease, Dr. Chen explained. Her decision to seek immediate medical attention likely prevented a potentially fatal heart attack. The stent placement was medically necessary and appropriate. Any delay in treatment could have resulted in significant heart damage or death. When Morrison tried to suggest that my symptoms could have been anxiety-related, Dr. Chen's response was emphatic. Absolutely not. The cardiac catheterization showed clear arterial blockage that had been developing over time. This was not anxiety. This was life-threatening heart disease that required immediate intervention. Dr. Santos provided similar testimony about my glaucoma treatment, and Dr. Patel confirmed that my gallbladder surgery had been emergency treatment that prevented potentially fatal complications. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Foster, who methodically dismantled every claim about my mental capacity and psychological state. I conducted extensive cognitive and psychological testing of Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Foster testified. Her cognitive function is well within normal limits for her age group. She demonstrates excellent judgment, appropriate decision-making abilities, and clear understanding of complex situations. Dr. Foster then addressed the claims about health anxiety directly. Mrs. Henderson's medical utilization is entirely appropriate for someone with her documented health conditions. There is no evidence of hypochondria, health anxiety, or any other psychological condition that would impair her judgment about medical care. When Morrison asked about my pattern of seeking excessive medical care, Dr. Foster's response was sharp and professional. Mr. Morrison, seeking appropriate medical care for legitimate health conditions is not excessive. It's responsible. Mrs. Henderson's medical decisions have been consistently appropriate and potentially life-saving. But the real bombshell came when Margaret introduced the audio recordings. The courtroom fell silent as my recorder played conversation after conversation of Rebecca and Daniel dismissing my health concerns, questioning my mental capacity, and discussing the financial impact of my medical care on their inheritance. The most damaging recording was the Thanksgiving dinner conversation, where Daniel's voice could be clearly heard saying, "The bottom line is that Martha is spending through her savings on unnecessary medical care, and if it continues, there won't be anything left for anyone to inherit." Judge Coleman's expression hardened as she listened to the recordings. When the audio evidence finished, she looked directly at Rebecca and Daniel with obvious displeasure. "Mr. Morrison, do your clients have any explanation for these recorded statements about inheritance concerns driving their guardianship petition?" Morrison looked visibly shaken by the audio evidence. He requested a brief recess to consult with his clients, and I could see them huddled in urgent conversation in the hallway outside the courtroom. When they returned, Morrison attempted damage control. "Your Honor, my clients may have expressed frustration about financial concerns, but their primary motivation remains Mrs. Henderson's well-being and safety." But Judge Coleman wasn't buying it. "Mr. Morrison, I've just heard your clients explicitly state that their concern is protecting an inheritance rather than protecting Mrs. Henderson. How do you reconcile that with claims of altruistic motivation?" Morrison had no good answer, and the rest of his argument fell apart under Judge Coleman's skeptical questioning. Margaret then delivered the final blow, my comprehensive competency evaluation and the testimony of independent witnesses who could attest to my mental acuity and appropriate decision-making. Michael took the witness stand and provided devastating testimony about the Thanksgiving dinner conversation and his observations of Rebecca and Daniel's behavior. "Your Honor, I watched them threaten legal action against Mrs. Henderson because she refused to give them control over her medical and financial decisions. When I questioned their motivations, Daniel explicitly admitted that his concern was protecting his inheritance, not protecting Martha." When Margaret finished presenting our case, the contrast with Morrison's opening argument was stark. Where Morrison had presented speculation and financial concerns disguised as medical worries, we had presented comprehensive documentation of competency, medical necessity, and manipulative behavior. Judge Coleman called a brief recess before delivering her ruling, and I used the time to reflect on how completely the tables had turned. Rebecca and Daniel, who had entered the courtroom confident in their narrative of concern and protection, now sat silent and defeated as the evidence exposed their true motivations. When Judge Coleman returned, her ruling was swift and decisive. After reviewing all the evidence presented today, I find that Mrs. Henderson is a competent adult who is fully capable of making her own medical and financial decisions. The medical testimony clearly establishes that her healthcare utilization has been appropriate and necessary for legitimate medical conditions. She paused and looked directly at Rebecca and Daniel. I am deeply troubled by the audio evidence suggesting that this guardianship petition was motivated by financial considerations, rather than genuine concern for Mrs. Henderson's well-being. The systematic dismissal of legitimate health concerns and the threats of legal action constitute psychological abuse that has no place in family relationships. Judge Coleman's final words were devastating. This guardianship petition is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential elder abuse charges. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Rebecca's face was pale, and Daniel stared at the floor as the full implications of Judge Coleman's ruling sank in. But I wasn't finished. As we gathered our documents and prepared to leave the courtroom, I approached Rebecca and Daniel with an envelope I had been carrying in my briefcase. Rebecca, Daniel, I have something for you. Inside the envelope were copies of my new will and trust documents, along with the detailed letter explaining why I had chosen to disinherit them completely. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read the letter, which documented every instance of medical dismissal, every threat of legal action, and every indication that their concern was financial rather than genuine. You spent 3 years telling me I was too dramatic about my health, I said quietly, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had just defeated a coordinated attack on her autonomy. I was perfectly dramatic when I decided to disinherit you completely. Daniel looked up from the documents with shock and growing panic. Martha, you can't do this. We're family. Family members don't try to have each other declared mentally incompetent for financial gain, I replied. Family members don't dismiss life-threatening health conditions as psychological problems. Family members don't threaten legal action when their manipulation fails. Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. Mom, we can fix this. We can work things out. I looked at my daughter for what I knew would be the last time as her mother. Rebecca, you made your choice when you filed that guardianship petition. You chose money over our relationship, control over respect, manipulation over love. Now you'll have to live with the consequences of that choice. As I walked out of the courtroom with Margaret, I felt a profound sense of closure. The 3-year ordeal was finally over, and I had not only survived their attack, but emerged stronger and more independent than ever. The weeks following the hearing brought additional vindication. Detective Reynolds's investigation led to criminal charges of attempted financial elder abuse against both Rebecca and Daniel. Their attorney, Morrison, was censured by the state bar for filing a frivolous guardianship petition without adequate grounds. But the most satisfying outcome was personal rather than legal. For the first time in 3 years, I was free to make my own medical decisions without having every symptom questioned or dismissed. When I developed a minor skin condition that required dermatological treatment, I scheduled the appointment without hesitation or anxiety about justifying my decision. To anyone, my new estate plan ensured that my assets would go to organizations that actually helped elderly people maintain their autonomy and access appropriate medical care. The Martha Henderson Foundation for Elder Medical Advocacy would provide legal assistance to elderly victims of medical gaslighting and financial abuse. Rebecca and Daniel made several attempts to contact me in the months following the hearing, but I had no interest in rebuilding a relationship built on manipulation and financial exploitation. They had shown me who they really were, and I believed them. The most unexpected outcome was the support I received from other elderly people who had experienced similar family dynamics. My story, which became public through news coverage of the elder abuse charges, resonated with countless individuals who had been told they were too dramatic about their health concerns or too anxious about legitimate medical symptoms. I began speaking at community centers and senior organizations about medical self-advocacy and recognizing signs of elder abuse. The response was overwhelming. Audience after audience of people who had been made to doubt their own judgment about their health by family members with financial motivations. 6 months after the hearing, I received a letter from Rebecca expressing remorse for her actions and asking for forgiveness. The letter was well written and seemed genuine, but it came too late to matter. Some relationships, once poisoned by betrayal and manipulation, cannot be restored. I had learned that being called dramatic about health concerns was often code for inconveniently expensive or interfering with inheritance plans. I had discovered that family love could be conditional on financial advantage, and that concern for well-being could mask greed for assets. But most importantly, I had proven to myself that I was capable of fighting back against systematic psychological abuse and emerging victorious. The woman they had tried to portray as mentally declining and vulnerable had outmaneuvered them at every turn, building an impenetrable defense while they focused on their attack. As I sat in my garden on a warm spring afternoon, tending to the flowers Frank and I had planted together years earlier, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The chest pains that Rebecca had dismissed as anxiety had led to life-saving cardiac treatment. The vision changes that Daniel had called imaginary had required immediate glaucoma intervention. The abdominal pain they had labeled psychosomatic had been emergency gallbladder surgery. Every health concern they had minimized had been real. Every medical decision they had questioned had been appropriate. Every dollar they had grudged for my medical care had been necessary to preserve my health and independence. They had called me dramatic, but I had simply been advocating for myself, in a world where elderly women's health concerns are routinely dismissed. They had called me anxious, but I had been appropriately vigilant about maintaining my health and autonomy. In the end, their attempt to control me had freed me completely. By severing the relationship through their betrayal, they had eliminated the last source of manipulation and guilt in my life. I was truly independent for the first time in years, free to make my own decisions without having to justify them to anyone. The final irony was perfect. They had spent 3 years calling me too dramatic about my health. I had been perfectly dramatic when I disinherited them, and that drama had saved not just my inheritance, but my autonomy, my dignity, and my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.